Hello. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our ECDPM office. Welcome everyone here in the room and people following online via the live stream. Um, my name is Hanneke Napa. I'm leading the climate work here at ECDPM with a special focus on climate adaptation and resilience. I hope that this meeting is not too early for you. For us, the format is new, so we thought it would be good that people can come in, listen to an interesting discussion, and then go to work. So it's a bit of a test for us as well, but happy to see so many people here. So we are here today for the book launch of The Heat and the Fury on the Frontlines of Climate Violence, written by Peter Schwartzstein. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for being here. Um, so a few words on Peter's background for those who don't know him. Peter is a journalist and a researcher on the conflict climate nexus. He has been working on this topic for over a decade in more than 30 countries, including in the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. Peter has written for BBC, New York Times, National Geographic, Bloomberg, Business Week, and so on, and he is connected to the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. He's also a TED Fellow, and he's connected to the Center for Climate and Security in Washington. Before turning to Peter, I would like to briefly introduce to you our two discussants. So first, Sophie de Smet, who is my colleague, and Sophie is Associate Director for Peaceful Societies and Accountable Governance here at ECDPM. For family reasons, Sophie could unfortunately not be here in person, so she will join us online in a minute. And secondly, Roisin Durituli, Program Manager for the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, known as FBI for the European Commission. So welcome both Roisin and Sophie. And the three of us have worked together in the framework of a project called Cascades, which ended last year. And so we looked at transboundary climate risks in this project and how the EU can better deal with transboundary climate risks. And this is a topic that also is being discussed quite a lot in your book. So the climate security nexus has gained quite some importance, I think, in the last few years. We have seen at COP29 that ended just a few days ago, there was during the first week a specific peace day. The EU also has a climate security strategy. Maybe we can hear more about that in a minute. But like we also saw in our project, the Cascades project on transboundary climate risks, there is a structural underestimation of this climate security nexus, the link between both, because it's also very complex. And Peter tried to unpack this nexus, this connection, in his book. And you have taken professional and personal risks to explain to unpack this complexity. Why did you do that? What inspired you to write this book?
There we go. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to all of you for coming out early-ish on a Tuesday morning. So, I mean, there's as ever quite a few reasons that go into, and I'm grateful for this very well-thumbed-looking copy of the book at the front. This book is an attempt to lay out the full volume of violence that is already connected to climate change. The thing that struck me a decade or so ago or a bit over a decade or so ago when I started working in this field, was that even in some environment and climate circles, there's the perception that climate-related violence is more of a hypothetical future threat than something that is already a fixture of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people's lives. So by trying to kind of lay out at least a degree of that violence in a very accessible, jargon-free, human-centered way, sort of hoping to hammer home both the stakes, but as importantly, the nature of climate's contribution to violence, because that's also something I argue that within parts of the climate security community is not super well understood. And to return to something you briefly mentioned, I also argue that we are systematically underestimating the amount of violence related to climate change because we're not fully taking into account how climate is acting on other drivers of instability, like corruption, like inequality, like misinformation. And I'll try and do this in sort of as example a heavy manner as possible. Between about 2014 and 2017, I spent many months looking at how ISIS profited from collapsing agricultural conditions in rural parts of Iraq and Syria. And among the 120 or so villages in which I conducted a lot of groundwork, I found that some of the absolute highest rates of ISIS recruitment came from villages on the periphery of the city of Mosul, the largest urban center under ISIS control. And that struck me as quite an arresting finding, because those communities were by no means the poorest of the poor. Many of those villages had amenities that much more isolated, geographically peripheral places could only dream of. But what they did have was a close proximity to the city, and hence a strong awareness of the growing gulf between their livelihoods, which were almost entirely dependent on agriculture and which were deteriorating in line with these worsening droughts. And on the other hand, the lives of the Moslawis, of the urbanites, which weren't great, but which were by and large a good deal less exposed to climate stresses. And the kind of resentment, the kind of the grievances that sort of mushroomed on account of that profound awareness were kind of very effectively weaponized and leveraged by ISIS recruiters when they came along. Equally, one of the other things I try and do in the book is to show some of the kind of wider pathways, the causal mechanism in a sort of jargony way of putting it. And that's that if you've heard anything about, if you're new to the subject but you've heard a little bit about it, you're perhaps aware of the threat multiplier formulation, which perhaps sort of implies that climate is sort of throwing fuel on already smoldering fires, and that's certainly true in some instances. But I've come to see kind of climate, to pathologize things a little bit, as a little bit more of a kind of termite-like thing, insofar as it is eating away at the structural supports that we as individuals and communities and even nation states turn to at times of crisis. And by that I mean as drought and other climate conditions replicate themselves year after year, people's psychological reserves, people's financial reserves, people's local conflict resolution mechanisms are basically collapsing along the way. And one final example before sort of ending my babble on this count. I found in Burkina Faso, there was this sort of extremely young, kind, sensitive farmer called Umar, whose family farmed a small patch of land about 2 hours out of Ouagadougou. And for years, he had resisted the entreaties of the VDP, a government-affiliated militia that had grown up as a bid to beat back the jihadists. But after, I think, the fourth failed harvest in 5, such was his degree of financial desperation, such was his degree of poverty, that he ultimately felt he had absolutely no choice but to join up with this militia, and he died in battle with jihadists a few months later. Anyway.
Okay, yeah, there are... Now it should work. I think every chapter discusses another, like you go to a different place in the world, including South Asia as well. The story on Bangladesh made quite a big impression on me. There's also the story about Nepal. Perhaps before we ask some more general questions, can you tell the audience about the pirates in the rivers in the southern part of Bangladesh? Because that was something I was absolutely not aware of. So
I guess there's something about the term pirate that brings out our collective inner child, even though if you think about it, I mean, pirates are just burglars and murderers and bandits on boats. But no, this was we'll try and answer that. But I mentioned ISIS, I mentioned this sort of jihadism crisis in the Sahel, but the vast majority of violence that climate change is contributing to is much more localized, much more low level, much less ostensibly connected to sort of globally significant geopolitics. And it's while I was on a completely unrelated Nat Geo assignment in the Sundarbans region of coastal southern Bangladesh that I happened totally by accident to stumble on this pirate scourge. And basically what you have there is large numbers of farmers who have been displaced from their lands due to rising seas, increasing salinity of the soil, and an array of other non-climate troubles. And many of them are moving to Dhaka, kind of contributing to its growth as this absolutely massive mushrooming megacity. But the vast majority of people don't want to leave their local area. And one of the few alternative livelihoods is fishing. And this means that you have ever greater numbers of people that are sailing into these kind of long-time pirate-infested sort of jungle waterways. And as the volume of potential hostages increases, so too does the number of pirates, because it becomes that bit more lucrative for these pirates to make a living kidnapping and sort of pilfering the goods of these fishermen and honey collectors and others who cross their path. But this was sort of one of these instances where, fortunately, I didn't have to undertake much, if anything, in the way of personal risk, because these pirates are savvy enough to realize that if they attack foreigners, if they attack well-dressed Bangladeshi tourists, that will invite the kind of government response that they would much rather do without. So the way that one fisherman put it to me, like, you are safe and I am not. And just a little illustration of the kind of localized violence that is absolutely swelling for reasons connected to climate.
Yeah. So you talk about the climate security nexus through stories, giving very concrete examples. But if we could generalize, do you think that there is a climate or environment angle linked to each and every conflict?
I mean, certainly this is a somewhat self-serving narratives, the old line of, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But yes, I would argue that there are increasingly few, if any, or none, sort of conflicts that don't have some kind of climate angle. It's not necessarily a particularly big one. It can just be quite a tangential one. But even if one looks at all of the, headline-grabbing major conflicts in the world, every one of them has some sort of climate association. I mean, take Sudan. The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, one of the two main protagonists to the conflict, have benefited tremendously from their access to very cheap, heavily subsidized Libyan fuel flowing over the border. And given the extremely dynamic, kinetic nature of the conflict there, the very fact that they have that superior short fuel supply chain has enabled them to kind of range around the country with much greater facility than they otherwise might. And yeah, I mean, maybe we can get into what this means collectively for the West a little bit later, but it's almost always a factor.
Yeah. Okay, so perhaps a last question from my side before we turn to Sophie. And this book is written for a wider, more general audience, not necessarily people with a background in climate or security studies. So the question is, who do you hope will read it, and how do you envision it contributing to the broader discussion on climate change?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I hope everybody reads it. It's a measure of how sort of poor a salesman I am that there are no books for sale here, but we can get onto that later. There's a few things. First of all, I'm hoping that this will appeal to a slightly broader series of political constituencies than climate books have previously enjoyed. Most climate books come at this through the prism of justice and human rights and ecology, issues that, for whatever reason, don't always resonate with certain political constituencies in a way that national security ramifications often do. Equally, again, I hope that people just, if you don't care sufficiently about the educational or healthcare or other troubles that climate change is sort of exacerbating and aggravating in its wake, well, I'm hoping that one will care about the greater degrees of violence and intense insecurity that it's contributing to. Mm-hmm. And just maybe an example on that front. Most of the climate security field and most of my book is centered on the experience of poorer parts of the world. And there's very good reason for that, because climate-related violence is almost always a sort of ugly marriage of climate stresses and poor quality governance, both of which are found in greater degrees in poorer places. But as our own climatic conditions in richer parts of the world become that little bit less hospitable, and as our own, I don't know, to put it generously, our own qualities of governance waver here or there, we too are starting to see variations of in miniature of climate-related violence. And being based in Greece, I'm based in Athens. I've had this project with two anthropologist colleagues for the last year and a bit, looking at the relationship between extreme heat in the summer months and violence against women. And there's a number of non-climate reasons as to why violence would surge during those periods, but we found a roughly 350 to 400% increase in various forms of violence against women between June and September. So in various ways, shapes and forms, this is a crisis that is coming for us directly rather than just kind of indirectly.
Okay, yeah, a very important message. So I would like now to turn to Sophie, who will appear behind us on the screen. And Sophie, as I said, is leading the work on peaceful societies and accountable governance here at ECDPM, and she has read the book and she will react from her perspective in about 10-15 minutes.
Good morning,
Sophie.
Good morning, everyone, and I hope the connection works well and that you can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, as Hannah mentioned. Those are the struggles of young parents. I will just pick up on a few points because, of course, I can't do justice to the entire book, which I really enjoyed reading, and it's a very welcome change from maybe the program evaluation reports and policy documents that we devour at ECDPM. Half kidding, we still enjoy reading those as well. But I'll just pick up on a few points that I thought really spoke to me. And actually, Peter, you already mentioned a few of them. The first one that I wanted to sort of pick up on was what you mentioned about governance and how it's never just climate change alone, but really the interaction with socioeconomic realities and political realities and how those are being used and abused and governed. I think one of your key points is that those places that are suffering the worst from climate change impacts are also the one with the worst records of governance, and that can become a universal issue, as you just mentioned. And I think the stories from Iraq and Syria and the ISIS recruitment there, I think, are really powerful in showing how, decades of socioeconomic turmoil, growing urban-rural disparities, inequalities, but also deliberate exclusion of certain minorities and communities preceded this rise of ISIS, and how ISIS really tapped into that very purposefully and deliberately, into that discontent with existing modes of governance and governments. And I think sometimes in Western media, there's still kind of this portrayal as these groups kind of emerging out of nowhere without taking the necessary time to unpack the very complex, reasons why they are supported in many places, and sort of the underlying and the complex dimensions of recruitment and radicalization, which include, and I think that's a really powerful message of your book, increasingly climate change discontent. So I think, effective governance mechanisms, but also what you mentioned, conflict resolution mechanisms. I think this is also something that came up in your stories about Iraq, but also the Sahel. At the state level, subnational level, but also local level, will be very key to mitigate those tensions. But at the same time, climate change is eating away at the foundations to do this. But those mechanisms will be key in regulating, basic services, access to natural resources in an inclusive and participatory way, so that everyone is really on board. So investing in these governance structures that are effective will be, with however much or however little funding there will be going into climate change adaptation. And I think, your book contributes to highlighting how those mechanisms are really essential. And with regards to inclusive and participatory measures, I think, I really like the sections on how climate change has gendered impacts with rising levels of domestic violence against women and girls, but also, how it's affecting boys and men in as climate violence is expanding. And so I think to understand also the impact of climate change and then also design effective measures to combat that, looking into gendered impacts across different groups is really key, and I really appreciated that your book highlighted that. A second point that I wanted to highlight from the different chapters is also how we need to really look at local realities and design local responses, but then also balancing the responsibility between local actors and national central governments. I think local communities are, at the forefront of tackling climate violence, whether it's the section on Iraq, talking about how farmers were dealing with mismanagement of water and how that was then also, violently used by IS, but also the image of a Greek farmer just, waiting for firemen to arrive to help him while they were battling another wildfire closer to hotel resorts where there were tons of foreign tourists. So, there's a growing realization that to design effective climate response measures, we will have to really work with local communities and local realities. And I think probably there's a growing realization that certain sort of large programs have not worked that well because they haven't really understood the local realities on the ground. In that regard, I also really, the story of the Mauritanian farmer plugging in a Senegalese SIM card to get, weather information and forecasting is really telling. For him, the climate change impact, the borders of where he lives don't matter. They will cross borders, these climate change impacts and climate violence as well. And in a recent evaluation that we undertook, there were similar stories of, how technical and financial partners are trying to really look at landscapes and, understand how borders don't really mean anything to design programs that take into account the realities. Just an example, there was a cross-border program funded by the EU, for example, that promoted climate-smart agriculture in the Omo Delta region in southern Ethiopia. That led to a food surplus. And traders from Kenya started going to those markets because the markets in Kenya were way too far and so very costly for them. That trade relation also led to, better communal relations between those border communities because they saw a joint interest, and they started also discussing common drought response measures and disaster risk reduction mechanisms. And I think those are examples of how you can make local responses very effective. At the same time, I do think that we shouldn't swing the pendulum too far in putting all of the burden and the responsibility on local communities for mitigating climate change and also climate violence, but that's, central governments still have a responsibility there as well. And this is a tall order. This goes to climate diplomacy, which, looking at the outcome in Baku, I think a lot of us have, concerns about the state of climate diplomacy at the moment and how we can bring together states in a functioning multilateral mechanism. So maybe there's a way to rethink those current mechanisms to advance with smaller climate clubs, minilateralism with countries that want to advance more than maybe others, and sort of, trailblaze some of the approaches that will be needed to tackle the growing challenges of climate change and climate violence. Maybe a third and final point, I really welcomed your message that we should question this kind of us versus them rhetoric. In chapter 8, you bring out the point that no region will be immune from climate violence, but you also note how policies from the West related to trade, agriculture, energy transition have possibly harmful effects and risk contributing to actually increasing climate change challenges across the globe. And this idea of transboundary climate risks, cascading climate risks that Hannah alluded to in her introduction, it was the name of a big project that we were part of, and Hannah led our efforts in that. And this very idea that climate risks cascade across sectors, but also across borders, and how, you need to have a systems approach when thinking about these issues. And if you're going to tackle one sector, that will have little effect if you're not going to take into account energy trade, agriculture, migration, security. So I'm very happy to see that your research also, corroborates and sort of supports that finding that our systems are interlinked and that there's no escaping from sort of the damaging effects that climate change could have. And there's a need to rethink global cooperation and really develop partnerships. For example, if the West is serious about ending fossil fuels, it will never be able to credibly push for that if we continue supporting our own energies through subsidies, and we will never convince others to do the same. So this will require also crossing audiences, crossing sectors, financial, development practitioners, humanitarian, education sector. You mentioned at some point that a CIA director attending a water conference was questioned. And I think that's telling. We will need to cross boundaries and also the people that we talk to and how we design effective responses in an integrated manner. This will be incredibly complex, but I just don't see another way to do it. So we need to increase attention for this topic. More work needs to be done, like yours, but also ours in terms of policy analysis, in terms of making clear that climate violence is a challenge for all of us, and only an integrated approach will be able to at least try to make, design a response for that. So I think those are sort of three main points that I wanted to highlight, and happy to respond or participate in the following discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sophie, for bringing up these 3 points. I would like to invite Roisin here to our small stage, but and before giving the floor to Roisin, perhaps Peter, I want to give you the opportunity as well to quickly react to what Sophie said.
Well, thank you. I'm extremely susceptible to flattery, so the kind words go far. No, I mean I completely agree with all of your insights. And I mean just to say a bunch of additional things that would no doubt be very much on your radar, Sophie, and that of everybody else. I mean, a lot of this can seem quite intractable. So when we talk about governance and its the impact of poor governance on climate-related violence, at the same time as that poor governance is contributing to violence, the quality of governance is itself often being undermined by climate change. I mean, just even in a rich country, Western context, the US government's capacity to respond to the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in the mountains of Western North Carolina a month or two ago was compromised by the fact that the very same bridges and roads that they needed in order to distribute aid and in order to kind of launch search and rescue operations had themselves been washed out and blown away by that crisis. So, I mean, what's already quite a grim, dispiriting part of the climate discourse can seem that bit more dispiriting and that bit harder to tackle, not least because, I mean, one last remark along those lines. I mean, a lot of the work that I've done in the Sahel has centered on farmer-herder conflict. And a lot of the worst bouts of violence between farmers and herders that I personally documented came in areas where there was no state at that point. It had been hollowed out by chronic dysfunction. It had been sort of blown away by an array of security crises that were not themselves necessarily related to climate change, thereby ensuring that at a time when people needed mediation, either at the hands of government partners or at the hands of NGO partners, nobody was left. And then, I mean, one final thing, a lot of this is also just boils down to money. I mean, if you are a country like Niger, you have something like 1/30 of the number of civil servants on your payroll as a country like France or Belgium does, thereby ensuring that you just don't have the cash to kind of send administrators to places where kind of administration is simply not a thing. And so we can rail often extremely correctly against that poor quality governance, but there are plenty of reasons that are beyond these states' capacity to control as to why things are as bad on the governance front as they are.
Yeah. Talking about governance, which I found remarkable in your book, are the examples from, I think, Nigeria and Niger, where governments are actually things that happen in countries. So, but perhaps we can talk about that a bit more during the discussion. Now I want to give the floor to Roisin. Here is a microphone for you.
Thank you.
So yes, please go ahead.
So firstly, congratulations, as I already mentioned. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this, and as Sophie said, I think, you know, from the institutional perspective, we do spend a lot of time reading a slightly drier policy documents. So this is, I think I'm always struck when trying to explain what I work on to family and friends, how difficult it is to explain the climate security nexus, because we sit in meetings and we discuss it as if it was a given to everybody. It's tremendously complex, as you've outlined, I think, so effectively in the book, the very specific localized nature of how these threats play out. And we in the EU, we use the threat multiplier terminology or phrase a lot, because I think it is quite an easy way to express how climate and environment kind of transpose onto existing risks. So yeah, congratulations on staying away from the jargon as much as possible. I think it was really interesting that you know, you showed a diversity of security environments and institutional environments, and how different environmental threats play out. I think a lot of us have very much this focus, certainly I do, in terms of also my field experience, on sub-Saharan Africa and how climate security, climate peace and security plays out there. So it was really interesting to see about, you know, the mangrove example was also, I mean, I think we're increasingly aware of the importance of preservation of mangroves in terms of their carbon capture capacity, but you know, and I did work on maritime security at one point in time, but I wasn't familiar with any of these dynamics. So I think it was, you know, really interesting to be able to plug into those very different contexts and see that while they're very different and require very localized response, there is a commonality, I think. And so those are some of the things that were interesting. I am, again, very conscious. You mentioned the streetlight effect at some point during the book. And there very much is, I think, a tendency to only discuss the hotspot regions. And I think we've discussed this before, which is why frameworks like, I was interested that you mentioned the phrase cascading risks. It was this huge research project that the EU supported, because we do have to get a handle on how complex these pathways are in order to move away from that streetlight. It is only agropastoralism. It is only desertification. And we need to understand how complex it is. I don't think we have the opportunity to just say, and I think your book outlines this very well, you know, it is what it is and we'll take it as it comes. There's a lot, and I think Sophie touched on this very, very well. There's a lot of value in terms of transmitting messages through stories. And I think that it's really clear that the human side of climate security is the one that people will be able to understand. I think that the importance of grassroots intervention is really clear for us. We talk a lot about, you know, community-based approaches, locally owned, bottom up. From our side, it is increasingly important to give those communities pathways to interact. And some of the contexts that you outline are so fragile, and the institutional structures are simply not in place, that it's not enough for us to say national adaptation plans need to be conflict sensitive and conflict prevention frameworks need to be climate sensitive. I think as international partners, we need to be very aware of how complex this is. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Mali, and inter-institutional coordination and interministerial even communication is something that in contexts like this is extremely difficult. And when you add the transboundary dimension, it is very, very complex to engage. And so we need to have a commitment to partners to say we will stay the course with you, and not only just, you know, support drafting of sensitive climate documents and policy implementation guides. I think we need to go a lot further. Otherwise, we are slightly condemning communities to do the heavy lifting for us and expecting that by some kind of alchemy, institutional transformation and national adaptation plans will become effective. And I really don't think that is it's neither ideal nor should it be asked of communities, and as you've outlined, very fragile environments. I thought the aspect of technical cooperation as something that can really not substitute but complement in very, very difficult political environments. So you mentioned Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. Clearly now that has become even more complex, and I understand, caused you to have to rejig a little bit some of your thoughts on it. We also have very interesting examples from Central Asia, where political dialogue and formal political dialogue at the high level is something that is simply not feasible, at least not visibly, and does not lead to much substantive progress. And yet, ministries of the environment, ministries of water, ministries of land resource do sit down with each other, because the climate scientists, the agronomists, and the hydrologists understand that if they don't do so, that they really, really cannot move forward. So I think that is something that really comes out in the book and is quite interesting. I think that I was very interested by the example of Nepal in terms of people relying on mega projects and saying this dam or this reservoir will be the panacea, and we don't necessarily need to look at smaller infrastructure and local administration, local governance. I think that's something that is, let's say, a very timely reminder at a moment when many partners tend to think, okay, there are very high tech macro solutions to all of this, that all climate security action needs to be multi-level. We cannot simply rely on community level, nor can we rely on simply mega projects to address the complexities of these threats. So yeah, a systems approach, as Sophie outlined. I mean, you quoted one of our partners from UNEP with whom we worked closely in Nepal and Sudan, and talking about the cookie cutter approach. And anything in fragile contexts, we can't apply. Good governance, good development support will not be based on a one-size-fits-all approach. But we've never seen it more clearly as we try to interact with the breadth and the complexity of climate and environment threats. I think that one of the things that came back again and again, whether it was Nepal, whether it was Bangladesh, Iraq, was urbanization and migration of the rural poor who are dispossessed of land and resources that they have traditionally used to sustain themselves to the cities. I think for us this is one of the biggest questions, because, as I say, we still do tend to talk about climate security in a agropastoralism or access to water, farming communities, arable land frame, and we really need to start understanding, and I think the book transmit that message very, very clearly, that we need to understand how climate, environment, peace and security will manifest in urban environments. We already know, we have the demographic projections. We know how many people are going to be living in the world cities by 2050. Most of those people will not have access to the basic services which caused them to move and leave their rural environments. And so I think it's for me, I'm just asking for a sequel already, I think the urban, there you go, exactly. You already have the title. So I think that for us, this is, I mean, I always talk about this, and I'm sure certain people have heard me always, mention urbanization as the emerging issue. And actually, I need to retire the moniker of emerging issue, because it is no longer. We know that these migratory flows have been happening for decades, and so we definitely need to broaden our understanding of what they mean. Yeah, on the Sahel, perhaps just to zone in on one of the regions I know the best. I think basically the Sahel has become one of the most studied regions, for good reason, right? All of the climate and environment threats are there. I think it's a particularly complex case, but as we know, I mean, certainly in terms of the EU and international engagement in the Sahel, it was initially very much perceived as a security crisis. And at a certain point, it became very clear that it was a crisis of governance at all levels. And so, as you, again, very clearly outlined in the book, it was referenced that extremism in the Sahel was not generally based, and of course there are outliers, and it's a very complex phenomenon, but all research points to the fact that extremism in the Sahel did not lie in theological convictions and a faith-based urge to join these groups. It was very much about economic concerns and livelihoods. And so I think that that is one of the key issues. And Iraq, there were similar linkages which were very clearly drawn out. I think that in terms of the breakdown of the social fabric, which can be hastened by governance, but can be dealt the death blow by climate change and environmental degradation, where people's way of life and their legitimacy structures and the patronage networks that they have relied upon for, in many cases, centuries or millennia, have simply ceased to exist. It's very interesting. We mentioned the retreat of the state. We often talked in Mali about the re-establishment of the state, and I remember meeting quite an elderly man from the Mopti region, and who had, if I recall correctly, passed through about 9 checkpoints to come and meet us. So, at quite significant personal risk to himself. He was coming from really one of the kind of farthest flung communes, and was meeting us in Mopti in the center. And he said, the last administrator I met was a Frenchman, So he said before the Malian army came as a result of the security crisis, he and his far-flung commune had never met a representative of the state. And that's what you're dealing with. And so when we come with preconceived ideas, which represent our own reality of what institutional structures, of what state provision looks like and what legitimacy looks like, we are also condemned to failure in terms of, our adaptation to the realities. And so I think it's incredibly important to base our work on this. I think the whole idea, and it came across in pretty much every one of the cases, it's not so much scarcity, because very often these are populations which have been dealing with scarcity of resources, of economic outlets, of livelihood potential for centuries. They have never known abundance, but what they have known is predictability. So it is when, and again, it's very clear with regard to rains. I think one of the quotes is at the very beginning. It's bad rains, bad government, bad times, and I thought that was really I think that was from Iraq, but it was very, very clear that it's the predictability and the ability to then adapt to this, because we keep asking communities and states to adapt to climate, but only if we can give them tools, and even then some of those tools will never be able to foresee the degree of disruption of, again, for example, hydrological cycles that allow them to mitigate some of these tensions. And I think it's a tremendously interesting example. There are many tools which are used, many tech tools, transboundary dimensions of certain interventions that we've had have been really successful in showing. But I think, and this is a little bit an aside, that we must be careful not to cause a digital divide, I would say, in terms of, relying too much on the high-tech solutions and leaving communities behind, because they are the ones who understand and who will be able to tell us what works and what doesn't work in their own environments. I think the book is extremely effective in drawing out what we mean when we talk about intercommunal tensions. Again, it's a phrase that I think those of us in Brussels in this room probably just pronounce, and then other people are, a little bit unclear on what that really means. You mention in great detail, but also in a very accessible way, how pastoralists are very often seen as the interlopers. And I think I was very conscious of, agropastoralism was when I first started working in Africa, it was pretty much one of the first phrases I heard. And you kind of think, oh, okay, let's explore this a bit further. There are self-perpetuating dynamics, and this is where instrumentalization and misinformation comes in, because the same messages around pastoralism, which is very often then conflated and with certain communities, and the Pool community is one example where there is a conflation of pastoralism with terrorism, and that leads to mass stigmatization, and so it is just a vicious circle. Absolutely. The same messages I heard in Mali in, let's say, 2015, I was hearing 3 and 4 years later in Burkina, and again 3 and 4 years later in Ghana, where this, and this comes to where climate change and, you know, can be instrumentalized in the same way. I think it's an external problem. This is not a governance issue. This is not about elite capture or corruption, which is one of the main spoilers that comes out in your book also. It is very easy to blame on these dynamics and these security issues on exogenous threats, whether that be external groups who are moving through, even if these groups have moved through for millennia, or indeed climate change, which is very easily laid at the door of other nations. I think that in terms of multilateralism, it's I think there is a little bit of a COP hangover this week. I think you draw out very well the fact that you know, at every level the same resentment takes place, and I think that it is incumbent upon us all to, and those of us who work in institutional settings, to ensure that, you know, donors and partners like the EU can engage not only with these communities very visibly, but also really ensure that when we are trying to support both at subnational, national and regional level, and I do think that at regional level, there is an untapped resource. You mentioned IGAD in the book. IGAD is one of the leaders, but there are many other regional bodies, whether they are regional economic communities in the sub-Saharan African sense, or governance authorities for water, transboundary water sources. I think that we need to support these spaces. It is a challenging time for multilateralism. It will only become more challenging as of, you know, January, I think, in terms of this agenda. There are entry points that this, let's say, harder security environment brings in. You reference near the end of the book military capabilities. I think that this is something that is very easily understood. And actually, when you talk to military colleagues, they say, "Yep, no, we got it. We need to be more effective. You know, it's getting hotter. Our tanks don't work." You reference that U.S. Special Forces getting out of a Humvee and kind of, you know, drawing a sigh of relief because it is incredibly hot in many of these places. And when you don't even want to wear, you know, as a civilian, you never want to wear the helmet and the vest, but then you look at people in far bigger gear, which is more cumbersome. But I think that even though there's different terminology being used, resilience, preparedness, even within, you know, the EU's own discourse and how we are looking at this, there are huge opportunities because we can see, and I think books like yours are extremely helpful in showing that the cost of inaction is just going to be so great at every level that, you know, we must come together and resist the urge, I think, to engage in just endless competition.
Great, thank you, Roisin, for giving us this institutional perspective and also the policy and practical challenges that the EU faces in building system-wide resilience, as we used to call it in the Cascades project, in the face of a problem that is so complex. Before I turn to the audience, I would like to give Peter again the opportunity to quickly react to the many rich points that Roisin made.
Yeah, I would sort of once more sort of fall over myself to agree with every point. I mean, maybe I'll just sort of lead with one additional example to sort of help flesh out some of what was said, and that's the urbanization thing. So I and many others in the climate security field have been quite sort of focused on rural areas, and again, with good reason. I mean, agriculture and pastoralism are the professions that are uniquely vulnerable to climate change, and in most rural areas, they are the only economic games in town. And that's a pretty toxic mixture when added to the fact that at their times of greatest difficulty, they feel that government is abandoning them to an even greater extent than it previously was. But and this goes back to the kind of the cascading climate security risk component, the greater the rates of migration, and they really are picking up quite tremendously in every part of the world, and we are, of course, in Brussels. The M word carries a extra large amount of interest in cachet. But the greater that that migration flow picks up, even when, as is mostly the case, the migrant flows are contained within the nation state, the security ramifications are extremely broad. So there have been quite a few instances in cities like Baghdad, cities like Kathmandu, where I've come across fights or the near aftermath of fights on construction sites, many of which have been triggered by sort of conflict between the existing cohort of day laborers in many of these cities, many of whom are now having to compete with new arrivals from the countryside, many of whom come with skill sets that are not particularly useful in an urban workplace for anything other than day labor. And there have been quite a few instances where construction bosses have taken advantage of that kind of new surplus of labor to decrease wages, and surprise, surprise, people are furious. Equally, quite a few instances in which authorities have lost control of various neighborhoods in cities like Dhaka and cities like Karachi, because, I mean, such is the inflow of people into condensed spaces, such as the kind of recruitment opportunities for gangs, many of whom find that these kind of new arrivals arrive without safety nets, without sufficient local contacts, and kind of sufficiently economically desperate as to be extra easy prey to their advances. But, I mean, when we talk about migration, a lot of the time, of course, we look at the individuals themselves, we look at the receiving communities, but we don't necessarily look at what becomes of the places that they've left behind. And a lot of the time, not only are these villages losing the critical mass of residents that they need to sustain small businesses, thereby leading to this kind of economic death spiral, but you're also losing, and this goes back to something we briefly discussed before, you're losing the leading lights, like the people who are most inclined to migrate in greatest numbers and most inclined to migrate first are the best and brightest, the people who are most involved in local conflict resolution mechanisms, most involved in maintaining these communities' sense of self. And to go back to the ISIS example, again, a lot of the communities where ISIS was most successful were really only communities in name. They were clusters of individuals who had lost their capacity to kind of police their disputes, big and small, thereby ensuring that there were even fewer wise old heads, even fewer obstacles to ISIS recruitment than there otherwise would have been. So yeah, it's very much a cascade.
Okay, great, thank you, Peter. I would like to give our audience the opportunity to ask some questions or comments on the book. So there will be a microphone going around, I think. So please. So, okay, yes, we can collect, I think, 2-3 questions, and then you can react.
Thank you. I'm not sure is it working?
Yeah, it works. Maybe you can also say your name and organization.
So I'm Lavinia. I'm a project manager at International Crisis Group based here in Brussels. And I follow climate security for our EU team in Brussels. I'm not a climate analyst, but I'm just following it for the Brussels purposes. So I haven't had the chance to read the book, and I would love to get it at some point. I've already got approval from my office to pass it around. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not going to repeat all the examples. I agree to all of what all of you have said, but I just wanted to bring an example that I haven't heard yet, and I think that's very relevant. And I don't know if you're planning on working on it, and that's the Amazon. For those who haven't seen it yet, Crisis Group has written a report on violence in the Amazon related to deforestation and how armed groups are taking over and controlling the illegal logging and so on, and how little control the governments have over these armed groups. So I don't really have a question per se, just wanted to bring this extra example because, I mean, I don't have to tell anyone how important the Amazon is for the entire planet, but also for the local populations that now find themselves in the need to migrate towards, well, the north. And obviously after the latest election results, that's going to be harder and harder. So that's it from my end. I invite everyone to read the report. A little bit of self-advertisement.
Okay, thank you. There's, yes, another question there.
Thank you. So I'm Clémentine from Interpeace, International Peace Building Organization, and I have one comment and one question. The comment is that at Interpeace we've been advocating for years on the need to integrate more humanitarian development and peace policies and practices, not only trying to make sure that programming and policy do no harm, but also proactively contribute to peace. And there is a need to integrate the climate aspect of that as well, because as long as climate impacts the root causes of conflict, then we need also to tackle those root causes on peace programming, but also to integrate the climate dimension of that. So that's just one comment, and we really support what Sophie said about the need to integrate that, and also the need to integrate the local communities and to bring the localization agenda to the table. And that leads to one of my questions for you, Peter, or also for any other people who have the answer to that. I think that climate is also remain widely misunderstood from a citizen perspective, and that people, when not only in the southern part of the world, but also in Europe, when you ask people like citizens what climate means, I think that there is still this very distant polar bear image in their mind, and also that we need to stop using thermic cars, but they don't understand how much climate will impact daily lives on every aspect of our daily lives. And my question for you, Peter, is to what extent all of the climate and conflicts interplays that you witnessed were understood by the people who were experiencing it as a wider climate problem, and not just, oh, we have seasonal variations and that impacts the season, the yields, and our agriculture and livelihoods. And how we can also make sure that we reconnect what happens at the very local level to the very global policy agenda on climate change, and making sure that this is widely understood, because that impacts also misinformation, that is a leverage of recruitment, and also to what extent those armed groups can use that, and also understand this wider debate that we have at the policy level. Thank you.
Okay, great question. Perhaps one more? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Olivier Thierry. I'm the Deputy Head of Staff of the Belgian Minister of Cooperation. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm very much triggered by it, and very much interested to read the book. I have two thoughts. One is really on the long term, and where are we heading to with this? In the past few years, research has been done on scenarios on global warming, and in the worst case scenario, we are looking at certain zones in the world where it will become virtually impossible to live in by the end of the century. I'm a bit surprised that this has not picked up more attention, because I mean the consequences of this are really dramatic. Of course, there are many hypotheses underlying it, but it seems to me pretty clear that this will put a huge pressure on local communities to migrate, and no longer between countryside and cities, but really from one country to another. So it seems to me that this is something that we'll really have to start taking into account, and I'm wondering what your vision is on that, really on the long-term consequences of this. As you speak of climate violence, it seems that we'll be facing a lot more of this. A second thought on your final remarks that really spoke to me on the communities and villages that are left behind, and you questioned whether there will be enough critical mass to really have a sustainable future for these communities. This is something from development cooperation that also really makes me question what we are doing, because there are so many scenarios that we are looking at, and it becomes difficult at some point to really be sure of, are we still doing the right thing? Are we still having the right solutions for the problems that we'll be facing in perhaps 20 or 30 years? So it's again a bit the questioning of where are we heading towards, and do we really have the right solutions in place to tackle these issues? Thank you very much.
Okay, perhaps we can stop here for a moment and give Peter the chance to respond to these questions.
Yeah, a lot of great questions. To the ICG lady, I've been sort of roping a lot of your colleagues like Nazanin and Ulrich into my kind of book sort of dog and pony show over the last month or two. So thank you for coming. So I have no examples from Latin America in the book, and that's because I've been sort of adamant about grounding all of it in my own research, and I've simply done no work in that part of the world. Yeah, what we have in the Amazon is an illustration of the ways in which crime or violence can contribute to climate change. I mean, we know that in Colombia, a lot of the narcos, a lot of the kind of drug cartels are increasingly quite intimately connected to deforestation, as you're saying. Kind of a lot of their Brazilian equivalents and counterparts elsewhere in rainforest areas are actively contributing to warming. And then, of course, we have ways in which, just again to illustrate the all-encompassing nature of so much of this, we also have climate action that contributes to forms of crime. And I'm not just talking about the kind of ill-conceived and poorly implemented projects, like such are the amounts of money to be made in the green transition that we have, for example, Mexican drug cartels muscling in on lithium extraction there. Yeah, all of which is to say that this is something that is an all of society kind of series of consequences and will require an obviously all of society, all of government series of responses. To Clementine's question, basically everybody in these conflict climate settings is thoroughly aware that conditions are not normal. They're aware that they're experiencing things that their fathers and grandfathers before them had not. Of course, the vast majority are not necessarily able to present that in wholly scientific terms, but there's an awareness that this is new, and so much of it hinges, as Rasheen was alluding to the extreme unpredictability more than the degrees of absolute resource scarcity that can sometimes be a thing. And just to sort of flesh that out a little bit more, there's so much more to learn about the ways in which climate and violence fit together. And actually in January and March, I'm going to be in Iraq and Mauritania, respectively, trying to kind of flesh out what I deem to be one of the big, very kind of undercovered parts of all of this, and that's the mental health and trauma side. I mean, so much of the time when I've met people who've been involved in some kind of climate-related violence, they've sort of mused in a sort of very kind of confused manner as to how their cousins or neighbors or whoever else could have launched into basically irrational, wild forms of violence that so often ran counter to their own interests. And a lot of the time I've come to think that a lot of the time, the very fact that the rains are not falling as they once did, that birds are not migrating as they once did, the very fact that plants, if they bloom at all, are blooming at different periods of the year, is just contributing to a kind of extreme sense of beleaguerment, extreme sense of there's this new term, sort of solastalgia. It's basically being homesick without having left home, because your home no longer resembles the place that it once did. And a lot of the time that does seem to be contributing to even worse degrees of poor decision making that kind of characterize so many kind of conflicts, large and small. And no, I mean, just to the second part of your question, I'm not entirely sure this sort of entirely gets at what you're after, but yeah, I mean, we know that conflict and I mean, if you look at the most conflict affected countries in the world and you look at the most climate affected countries of the world, they're basically one and the same. And the more that we allow both issues to sort of go insufficiently mitigated and insufficiently tempered, the more that these troubles will simply mushroom. As to the final question, I think that, yeah, it's absolutely true that we already have a lot of rural agrarian communities that are basically unfit for habitation, that basically are not able to provide any kind of viable economic living for their inhabitants. And even well-targeted, well-conceived support measures like rolling out superior irrigation techniques and introducing seeds that are capable of withstanding higher temperatures, all that will do in some instances buy a degree of time. But I see this as one of the big, and perhaps one of the few enduring taboos in the climate space. And that's because a lot of the time, relevant nation states don't want to think about this because as far as they're concerned, there's no net positive. Like either you have these people migrate en masse, which I mean will be the answer whether they like it or not, or you allow them to fester in the countryside, becoming that bit poorer, that bit angrier, that bit more resentful, and hence that bit more inclined to involve themselves with various non-state armed groups whose consequences will be felt very far and wide. I mean, one of the few countries that may be grappling with that to a slightly greater and better extent than others is Bangladesh, where the state is trying to kind of redirect at a very low, insufficient level at the time being, but trying to redirect some of the migrants who were previously gravitating from villages to Dhaka towards some of the secondary and tertiary cities, many of which are kind of not mega metropolises in a way that the capital is. So yeah, ensuring that that kind of series of migration flows is much more evenly balanced and doesn't kind of fixate on a single city could be the, I guess, the least bad response for many places. Yeah.
Okay, good to hear that there can be some positive outcomes. I would like to end this session later on. We have some more time for questions, but with a small sense of optimism. But first, I think Hannah was next in line for a question. First, Hannah, the corner.
Hi, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Hannah Abdullah from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We largely view climate-driven violence and migration as a problem of the global south, using that for lack of a better term. But we're also seeing these problems more and more in the US and Europe, and you mentioned Greece just now, flash floods in Spain, hurricanes in the US, etc. And the internal the internal conflict, what's the title? Well, climate-driven displacement in the US, I think is currently, or in 2019, the numbers showed that the US was ranking 5th globally for climate-driven internal displacement. So my question is, from all the research you have done, how do you think the global north and south can better collaborate on, first of all, monitoring and modeling climate-driven migration, which is notoriously difficult to do, and there still is little data on this? And also, how can the global north learn more from the global south when it comes to things like rural-urban migration, which we are also seeing happening as the result of hurricanes in the US, for example, or flooding in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, good question. There was here, Carol, second question.
My name is Karel Uitendalen. I'm involved in a private sector program that is called Circular Migration for African Engineers. They come and work for 1 year here, and then they go back as the ambassador for the Belgian companies. And a question on fossil industries. Should we keep energy-intensive industries in Europe when Africa is endowed with an abundance of green electricity capacity?
Okay, difficult to respond. Okay, one here, another question in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Stelios Zachariou from the Greek Perm Rep, and I'm also a friend of Peter. So this is a question which both of you used a word. Let me find it because I wrote it down, which I thought was very interesting. Resentfulness. And I deal with migration in my portfolio now, which has not always been my portfolio. But in any case, I want to ask you both, to what extent do you think that this resentfulness will lead to dysfunctionality of international organizations, UN, IOM, UNHCR, Human Rights Council, EU. How will it impact migratory flows in the near future? Obviously, the answer, you've insinuated that migration will increase, will grow. And if there are any possible ways to mitigate these challenges and reduce this anger that is brewing in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, and in other places throughout the world. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Shall we stop here? And Peter, first you can react.
So to the lady from the German Marshall Fund, I mean, to riff a bit more off what you were saying, I mean, one thing we've touched on, but maybe could expand on that bit more, is that when I'm asked what I see as being the biggest global security risk to emerge out of climate change, I say it's its effect on state legitimacy. Now, this is something that, for the time being, is mostly playing out, again, in poor countries. The very fact that states' ability to provide sufficient wastewater disposal, adequate affordable food access, sufficient water, at least moderately satisfactory infrastructure, the very fact that that is being compromised for reasons that include climate change is contributing to all kinds of forms of kind of anti-state sentiment that these already disliked, distrusted states are not very well placed to withstand. And when one considers that, I mean, a lot of that worst dissatisfaction comes when there is a growing gulf between citizen expectations and the state's capacity to provide. If you think about it in those terms, that's really worrisome from our perspective here in richer parts, because we have very high expectations of state. We often have high levels of entitlement. And when, as I feel is almost inevitably the case, climate stresses and other troubles compromise our government's capacity even a little bit to provide those services, then I'm extremely wary of the impact on states, extremely wary of how citizens will respond. So there's certainly a lot for us to learn when it comes to how citizen anger is manifesting itself and what can be done to sort of temper that. I mean, it's certainly true that there is plenty for us to learn. I struggle for the moment to kind of put my finger on precisely what. I mean, as we saw in the kind of the post-mortem of the Valencia floods, it's the very fact that the early warning systems simply didn't function as they supposedly were is certainly a very cautionary tale. I mean, something similar in the horrible floods that afflicted parts of southwestern Germany and parts of Belgium 2 summers ago, were again, like particularly in I think it was the Ahr Valley in Germany, where most of the casualties played out. Kind of warning systems just didn't function. But I mean, that's the only sort of hard and fast takeaway I can get. But just an understanding that we are not immune from many of these wider troubles that are kind of thus far mostly in places that we struggle to identify with. Whether we ought to be moving industries to places with sort of richer solar and wind capacity, hydro as well. Yes, I don't know. All of which I would say is, the irony is that a lot of states that have invested heavily in hydro are in this deeply unfair, unjust world being punished for it in some instances. I mean, Zambia, which previously was one of the most electricity-rich countries in Africa, in large part due to the Zambezi Dam, has these prolific electricity shortages and is having to turn to coal to a greater extent than it has for decades, because prolific drought in the Zambezi Basin has dropped water levels below the point where the dam is actually able to generate sufficient hydroelectricity. So again, it's the perfect storm metaphor crops up. And as to Stelios's question, I mean, short answer is, with institutions themselves, I don't know, and I probably punt this one to Roisin, but I mean, we were riffing off what I see to be, and not just me, but I think plenty of others in this space see to be one of the looming storms from a Western or rich country perspective, which is intensifying anger among poor countries at the rich world's continuing inability or unwillingness to shell out sufficient sums for climate action. And without me necessarily soliciting people's thoughts, when I'm interacting with policymakers in different parts of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, they're bringing this up that bit more and in more intense, more angry terms. Now, I think a lot of the time there's an understanding that this is a very politically useful, politically salient tool for them to use at a time when you still have the legacy of colonialism and the anger that continues to engender. It's a very easy series of levers for politicians to pull. Will that manifest itself in international organizations? Quite possibly, but maybe a little bit too soon to tell.
Okay, Rasheen would also be happy to get your view on the last point.
Thanks. It's a very good question, because I think it is the word that, it plays out at each level. As we said, it is resentment that fuels intercommunal violence. It is resentment, as you outlined, between Ethiopia and Egypt that, fuels a lot of misinformation and tension around the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and it is resentment around processes like the recently concluded agreement, which has already, in the space of a few days, been, subject to huge contestation by many countries. I think that we create these spaces with an expectation that they will work and not require any kind of development or amendment, and I think that perhaps what we're seeing now is a contestation of those very spaces that were created to look at primarily the question of climate financing. So I mean, I'm watching this space along with everybody here. I think, I mean, I've never seen the strength of opinion and the vociferous nature of criticism post COP. I think you've rightly put your finger on the fact that there are questions that are very justified, and then there is also a very vested political interest from many interlocutors to keep this narrative going, also because it takes a lot of heat off what are related but separate problems of governance, corruption, elite capture, etc., etc. It's very complex, and I think that I can only come back to the EU's role in this, which is again very complex because it does feed into many of those discussions around the EU's position and the EU, particularly member states historically. But I think that we will continue to try and build consensus between those partners, and that is where a multilateral regional bloc can do a lot more, I think, because there is a legitimacy born of we have already and it's a difficult process to attain and maintain consensus on many of these issues, and I think that those are internal struggles within the EU that will continue and potentially deepen, but that in order for that resentment to be heard at all of those levels, there need to be mechanisms. In Valencia, it was very much, it was very interesting, not to be glib about something which was at its core a very human tragedy, but it was very interesting to see how quickly, when there are political cleavages within a country, how quickly that was instrumentalized. And that is a very strong institutional structure within an EU member state. And I think that showed, and to come back to your point, I think even in the last 5 years, let's say the European citizenry is a lot clearer on what this means and how this could also play out, because a lot of that kind of self-satisfaction and sense of entitlement that Europe has been alleged to have, and perhaps that's based in reality, I think has been slightly tempered now by an understanding that this will also affect us. Not in perhaps such dramatic ways, but because we are used to more, we are much less ready to accept even a little less. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have come towards the end, and it has been a lot of doom and gloom, but I think we must discuss this because it's the reality of the world today and for the decades to come. But perhaps we can end with a note of hope, and you quote in your book, I think it's the last chapter where you try to be more positive. Humanity is more inclined towards collaboration than clashing, and you talk about environmental peace building as a concept. Can you explain to us what this means and where it has actually worked?
So this, I mean, just to preamble that a little bit. I mean, the book is, when it comes to sort of climate change writ large, I'm not necessarily at the most pessimistic end of the spectrum, but what I'm looking at here are places where it's quite hard to derive too many shoots of optimism because of that potent mixture of intense climate stresses and horrifically poor governance. That said, because I do hope that people will, we know that doom and gloom is not a propellant to action. And so I do try and throw in, for the sake of expedience as well as hopefully delivering a kind of slightly wider picture, a final chapter that's centered on, as Hannah said, the environmental peace building, which to simplify grossly is looking at the many ways in which environmental and climate troubles can be harnessed to prevent, reduce, or in some ways outright stifle and recover from forms of violence, sort of killing two birds with one stone. On the one hand, deriving better environmental and climate outcomes, and on the other, hopefully having a good deal less violence. And it's certainly at a local level, it's a practice that holds quite a lot of promise. At a broader macro nation state level, good deal fewer sort of successful examples. But to leave a kind of real kind of hopefully more meaningful iota of optimism to grab hold of, the thing that has struck me, and that I think the kind of parting thought that I leave readers with in the book, is that even through this sort of decade and a bit of climate conflict reporting, I've been struck by the fact that there's not a lot more violence than there actually is. And you've got so many of these circumstances where life is dreadful. People are being thrust against one another by circumstances, thrust against one another by their own governments in many instances, and yet, for the most part, they refrain from violence. And that's, I mean, yeah, despite this sort of perhaps popular idea that we are kind of a thin veneer of civilization, sort of kind of separating us from kind of a war of all against all, it's not really true. And if you grant people the tools and the mechanisms to prevent violence, in the vast majority of instances, they leap on them, they seize upon them. So yeah, a little hopeful thought to send you on your way. And so one final thing, because I'm quite bad at this whole book promotion thing. I'm American enough to be willing to whore myself out, but British enough to feel embarrassed about it. But I'm told that the Waterstones branch here will have more copies from Friday or so. So were you to want to go along and splurge, as I of course would be grateful if you did, that's where you could go in the city.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. I think this 1 hour and a half has not been enough to fully capture the depth and the richness of the book, but I think we tried our best to shed light on this complex issue. As Peter said, you can buy the book in Waterstones here in Brussels, and I think also online on Footnote Press here in the publisher in the... Yeah, okay. So thank you, first of all, Peter, for being here with us. Thank you, Sophie and Roisin, for sharing your views. And thank you, everyone, for making your way here to our office. Thank you also for everyone online, and hope to see you soon. Thanks.